Well, you guys knew this was coming. You guys knew this was coming. The fake HDR. You know, this will be a long video, but it'll be a sad video because there's people out there creating controversy for views, just simply so they can profit money. They understand that this is a big game. They understand that a lot of people are playing this game. It's going to make billions of dollars. So what can we do? What can I do as a professional calibrator to get more views? Even though I might have to make an apology video maybe a week from now or 2 weeks from now, whatever. I'm not going to even mention this guy's name, okay? Listen, I already, don't like the fact that he's sponsored by a local TV shop that gives him all these televisions to test. Okay, and then he never ever, barely ever replies to anybody on the comment section. All right, but you guys know who he is. Here's my problem. I watched his video, and I'm trying to be fair here. I'm gonna be fair, and I'm gonna tell you exactly why he is wrong. Okay. I know he's got the instruments and he's going with the tone mapping, and I'll explain everything what that is, what he means by that. I'll dissect it for you here. Let me just grab a sip of my coffee, okay? Let the real teacher educate you as to why you should be very careful when it comes to listening to these so-called professional calibrators. Just like on that stone, you see two eyes and a face. This is coming from somebody who's 40 years old, been doing this for a long freaking time, has a lot of experience. Okay? So let me explain to you what HDR is first in basic terms, and then we're going to jump to this individual who calls himself a professional calibrator. The use of dynamic range has been since PlayStation 2. You guys, I'm sure, have seen SDR. On the DVD player says use SDR. It's called Standard Dynamic Range. Standard Dynamic Range has been around since 2000. Okay, it's nothing new. All right. What happened is, around 2010, 2011, Dolby Labs, that's mainly focused on the home theater, the surround sound. They started utilizing this new method for 10-bit color because they knew that the televisions will be pretty soon be in not HD TV but UHD TV with a 10-bit color panel. When you have a 10-bit panel television, that 10-bit panel can utilize a wider spectrum of colors. So Dolby started taking advantage of this 4K UHD panels 10-bit, and they started working on high dynamic range. What does the high means? High means higher dynamic range, meaning there's more depth of contrast on the picture, meaning that the deep dark levels are presented in a more natural way and the white bright levels are presented in a more natural way with a higher peak brightness with a much better color spectrum depending on what TV do you have. All right, so Dolby Laboratories created their first HDR patent, and they start selling that patent to all these televisions, to Sony, Samsung, Panasonic, LG, you freaking name it, okay? So all of these televisions companies, they started making 4K HDR televisions because they already have a high resolution of 8.3 million pixels, and they already have a 10-bit panel that is not 8-bit sRGB, it's a 10-bit panel. Therefore, they can utilize a wider color of spectrum. All right, so that's the just a little brief history of how HDR started, from standard dynamic range to high dynamic range. And the reason I mentioned this, because it's really important for you guys to understand that standard dynamic range was only used on 1080p televisions, HD TVs, and the older models like 1080 interlace and 720p. Standard dynamic range was used just for that. Okay, it was the 8-bit. Those televisions were 8-bit. Those HD televisions, 1080p televisions, they were all 8-bit panels. I want you guys to really pay attention to that. That's really important for you to understand. Before we jump into, I have to mention his name, this guy, professional calibrator Vincent Teo, okay, from UK. I gotta call him out, because come on, man. You know, yes, you have knowledge, but sometimes you go too far with your guessing. You're guessing with your instruments, and I'll get back to that later on in the video. Okay, with your Kelman that you have and your DCIP color measurement, I'll tell you why he's wrong about that. All right, so I want you guys to understand that the first part of this video is standard dynamic range was used on 8-bit panels, 1080p, and in some cases 1080i interlace plasmas and 720p plasmas, okay? We're talking 2008, 2009, 2010, okay? I had those televisions. I still have HD TV televisions. They're 8-bit panels. So I want you to understand that. HDR can only work on UHD, on 10-bit panels. You cannot implement high dynamic range on 8-bit panel televisions. It will not work, okay? Now, let me get back to Vincent. And it's a shame that he's calling this, and he's guessing, and he's calling this a fake HDR. It's a shame that he's using this word, okay? What he could have said, there was a bad implementation with the HDR. There was other words he could have used, but instead he used the fake HDR, and he shouldn't have used that term. It's just, I'll explain to you why that is a wrong term to use. It's misleading. First and foremost, I just explained to you that standard dynamic range can only work on 8-bit panels. All right? High dynamic range, you cannot utilize high dynamic range on 8-bit panel. You can't do that. All right? That you can call a fake HDR if you want to put HDR into an 8-bit panel, sRGB 8-bit panel, then you can call that a fake HDR. But you cannot call a fake HDR that's implemented onto a 10-bit panel, especially on the OLED or Q8FN or Q9FN or even this TCL R617 that I'm testing. You cannot call that a fake HDR. Now let's get back to Vincent because it's already 8 minutes. So let me talk about him and let me tell you why he is wrong. Yes, he's using a Kelman equipment measurements. He's got the software to measure, to see the peak brightness, to see the tone mapping, to see what kind of color accuracy are we getting. He's using all of these instruments to test. But here is the problem. This is where I stopped watching his video. This is where I stopped watching his video. Here's the problem. When he did this, when he went to the settings, and when he went to the display, and when he hit the HDR calibration, and he starts saying this is when he said this. For the LCD, if they say you have to keep it at 100, he automatically assumes that's a fake HDR. The reason they're advising you to keep it at 100 is because they don't know what type of TV you have. And that's why I told everybody to ignore this, all right? But he is basically saying because it says that you have to keep it at 100, that automatically this is a fake HDR. Well, doesn't make any sense. When they give you, obviously, the option to crank up that peak brightness. Look at this peak brightness. I can keep going. Look at this peak brightness. Look how bright that is. Does that look to you like a fake HDR? Let's click OK. Let's click OK. Let's go back to it. Let's go back to it. Does this look like a fake HDR? Does this look like a bad tone mapping to you? Hold on. Does this look like a bad tone mapping to you? Look at these colors over here. Let me get a little bit closer here. I'm on a TCLR 617 and look at this. Look at the contrast here. And look how beautiful this looks. Does this looks to you like a fake HDR? A fake HDR will not be able to implement something like this. You cannot get this type of a contrast ratio with the deep dark levels and in the distance. A fake HDR cannot reproduce these colors accurately like this. Maybe I need to bring my camera a little bit closer. Maybe I just need to bring the camera a little bit closer. Okay? Fake HDR will not do this. Okay? You cannot get these types of colors with fake HDR. You cannot have this type of a contrast ratio with a fake HDR. Okay? It's just simply not going to happen. Now, he says the tone mapping here, it's really bad. Well, how is that? How is that so? Based on what your instrument is telling you, he was measuring this. This is how he was measuring the tone mapping. He was measuring the tone mapping by sliding HDR calibration slider all the way to 200. Yes, if you keep it to 100, guess what, cousin? It will be dimmed down. The tone mapping is not going to be that great. Okay? If you do that. If you keep it at 100, look, it's not going to be that great. We all get that. But that's why you don't measure it. You don't measure it with 100 or with 300. Why don't you measure it all the way to the 500? Why don't you do this test, Mr. Vincent Teo? Why don't you keep it at 500, crank it up to 500, take your Kelman spec color equipment that you have, your Kelman color measurement DCI P3, go ahead, take it out, crank everything up to 500, and then do your measurements and see what you're going to get on the tone mapping here. There is no such thing as a fake HDR, okay? There is HDR here, but the implementations of that HDR, they're not as great as, let's say, Forza Horizon, okay? Forza Horizon has more advanced options for the HDR, okay? But to call it a fake HDR, that is really, that's like me calling a bottle of water, let's say Dasani, bottle of water, a fake water. Okay, it might not taste that great. It might not be my taste of a water, but it's still a H2O substance. It's still a water. Okay? It's really as simple as that. That's, I think, the best example here. You can't call Dasani bottle of water a fake water. It's still a water, but it might not be your it might not be your taste of water, but it's still a water. A salt water is still a water, but it's a salt water. It's not a fake water. That river down there is still a water, but it's not the kind of water that you might appreciate. but it's still a water. So you can't call it a fake HDR. You can say it's not the best HDR, but to call it a fake HDR or standard dynamic range being implemented into a 10-bit television, and then somehow the television is going to accept that signal. Somehow the television is going to accept that signal. Hold on, let me get out of here. Somehow the television is going to accept that signal and then be a fake HDR. I mean, come on, dude. I mean, seriously, come on. This just doesn't make any sense. Okay? That doesn't make any sense. You can't call something a fake HDR. Vincent, if you watch this video, it's okay. You can call it not so good HDR. But to call it a fake HDR, I'm really surprised. Coming from you, someone who's actually certified, professional calibrator, someone who actually studied this, the DCIP color measurement, the different types of panels, the resolutions, the chroma upsampling, all of this stuff, dynamic metadata, static metadata, all of these things that you know, that you have learned, and then for you to call this a fake HDR, it's really, man, it's just, come on. You don't have to like this HDR. You can say it's not the best HDR. Forza Horizon has better HDR implementation. But for you to call it a fake and to say that they're using a standard dynamic range implementation into a HDR, it's wrong, dude. It's wrong on so many levels. Okay? And then you telling people to turn off HDR off? I'm sorry, dude. But I'm not gonna be the one that's gonna listen to this nonsense. Because it is nonsense. Okay, man? There's no such thing as fake HDR. You should know this. You should know this, someone who actually studied this. You should know that you cannot implement a fake HDR. It might not be the best HDR implementation, but it's still UHD color. It is still HDR10 processing. It is still static metadata. It may not be the best static metadata for you because Rockstar maybe doesn't have that much of experience on this part, but to call it a fake HDR? Come on, man. And look, I respect you. I do. I'm not saying you don't have a knowledge. I know you have a knowledge. But this is why I'm kind of like surprised that this is coming from you. Because you do have knowledge and you do know how this works. I don't have to explain it to you. You know this better than anybody, how this works. But for you to call it a fake HDR, it's wrong on so many levels, man. Okay? And I'm pretty sure Rockstar not going to appreciate you calling a fake HDR. It's still HDR. Otherwise, we wouldn't see this, would we? Would we see this on our televisions if it was a fake HDR? But why don't you define fake HDR, Vincent Teo? Why don't you define it for me? Please, educate me. Educate me and define it to me in basic terms. Not just for me. How about for your audience? Define fake HDR. Tone mapping? Really? Because you're assuming that the tone mapping, it's not great because you have your settings on HDR slider turned all the way to 100, especially on your OLED. You assume right away that it's a fake HDR. Why don't you do this? Why don't you crank it all the way high, Vincent Teo? Crank this all the way high and then use your Kalman, use your spec color, use your color measurements of DCI-P3, use your peak brightness measurement, and why don't you go ahead and see if it's still a fake HDR. Sorry guys, but it's not a fake HDR. There's no such thing as fake HDR. It's not the best HDR implementation. That's what he should have said. But to say a fake HDR, it would be as equal to me saying a fake bottle of water. A fake Dasani bottle of water. It's as equal to that. Even though it's H2O substance, there's a water inside. But it's a fake bottle of water because it doesn't taste like a water. It doesn't taste to my preference. Ah, God. Ah, man, I just, dude, I give up, man. It's getting worse. It's getting worse on YouTube, man. It's getting like ridiculously freaking worse. I mean, honestly, nothing shocks me anymore. But anyway, there you have it. You guys can go back and forth. Leave me alone. I'm not going to even comment down below. There you go. I had to address this because it's just so stupid. Take care.